Our culture has left Christianity behind. It seeks to form us in its own image. Just like Daniel and his friends, young followers of Jesus must find a new way to embody their faith, one that's faithful to Jesus' teachings and one that is creatively missional towards culture. This is our calling. This is our battle. This is the Daniel generation. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Daniel generation. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the Sabbath.
Ooh, tough topic.
Yeah, well, I think it's
controversial, I should say.
It can be, depending on what background you come from. It's either controversial or you're just going, "What's that?"
Right.
I think growing up, the church's experiences I had, we didn't really talk about Sabbath much, except in reference to, the Jews used to keep the Sabbath and it was one of the commandments, but, whatever. We don't really do it anymore.
Or you, as a kid, you were like, oh yeah, that's Sunday, right? Church. That's the Sabbath.
Yeah, for us it's Sunday, yeah.
Right. That's kind of my only background on this. So I'm actually very interested to see where you come from on this.
You just see my glasses hit the mic. I was like taking a sip of my tea and it was like...
No, I didn't, actually.
Sorry, continue.
Yeah, so your view of this is going to be a lot different than mine because you've studied this kind of stuff. You understand more of culture and the history of what it means. I don't. And so I've actually never really thought about it much. So this will be interesting. So I'm kind of excited.
Sorry, I'm like adjusting my seat. Well, yeah, so... I've been thinking about this a lot because it was a conversation that came up among a lot of theologians and pastors I respect. So for instance, like John Mark Comer, his church did a whole series on it. He brings it up a lot in his books, and he does a lot of really great speaking and thinking on this topic. But more than that, even some other people that are edgier have a lot to say about this. Like Rob Bell talks about the Sabbath all the time. So I was like, okay, if these figures on, every side of the spectrum from, conventional, fairly orthodox pastor of a really thriving church like John Mark Comer, or someone who's more on the edges of what you would even call Christianity like Rob Bell, they're finding value in this. As Christians, there's got to be something to it.
Sure.
Which, beyond that, if God made it a commandment, there's got to be something to it. That should really be the idea, right? So what I want to do first, though, before we talk about it, is frame this through a particular lens and then read scriptures that kind of give us context for what the Sabbath was for the Jews, what the heart behind it was, and then what it ought to be for Christians. We're not going to talk about what day it is. And if you want to just answer the question, according to the Bible, what day is the Sabbath? It's Saturday. But
sure.
Do we have to observe it on Saturday? No. Yeah, I don't think so.
With the way that society has changed with electricity, that changed a ton of things. And the way that we work now, there's no beginning of the week anymore.
Exactly.
It's 7 days constant. So what is the beginning of our week? I think is the most important thing.
Yeah.
How should we start our week, whatever day of the week that is?
Yeah. Well, and I think once we get to the heart of what Sabbath ought to do for us, then it won't, we'll see that it, as Christians, it doesn't really matter. For the Jews, it was really important that it was that day because, and we'll get to that in a moment. But then, obviously the Christian church very quickly changed it to Sunday because that was the day of the resurrection. And those, the resurrection is new creation. This is supposed to restore us. So of course that made sense. And I don't think, we have to be legalistic about the day. So with that, let's do this. Let's open up the Bible. And we're going to read some of the Old Testament scriptures about the Sabbath, talk about those for a moment to give us some context for the types of things that this can help us with. And then we're going to read a fairly large section of Hebrews chapter 4, which will give us an idea as to why it's still important for us as Christians. And then lastly, we're going to read Jesus talking about the Sabbath to the Pharisees. And this is going to be the most important verse that we read. It's going to be the key verse, I think, for Christian understanding of how we can participate in this gift. So let's open up first to Exodus. And this is Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11. So this is obviously during the 10 Commandments when this command is first given. I should mention the first time you hear about the Sabbath is in Genesis. So actually, let me just jump there real quick. It's Genesis 2:2, because it's going to be referenced in all these other verses. So Genesis 2:2 comes at the end of the first creation narrative in Genesis. So it's all, on the third day, God did this. On the fifth day, he did that. And so then on the sixth day, he creates man, and he says that's very good. So then 2 starts like this, chapter 2. Thus the heavens and earth were completed and all of their hosts. By the seventh day, God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Verse 3, then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. So this is really important because this is the first thing that God declares holy in the scriptures. And so like the first time something occurs, it's really important. It kind of sets the standard for the rest of the times something will occur. So the first thing that God declares holy is the Sabbath. Your light just went out.
It did. I'll turn it back on. keep talking.
So yeah, I'll keep talking. We have a light that's gone out. So if you're watching the video version of this, then oh man, it's like Stranger Things right now. There we go. Let there be light, which is also from Genesis. So anyways, this is the first instance where we see the Sabbath. And this is where it becomes a really important religious paradigm for Jews because God rested. So God is resting from creating and doing and moving in the world. So how much more should we then if God did this, So then you get to Exodus. Moses goes on top of the mountain, gets the 10 commandments. And this is the first commandment that regards Sabbath. It's Exodus 20, 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Remember, God blessed it and kept it holy. So remember it, keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or daughter, your male or female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. So a couple things about this that are worth noting. So first off, we're participating in this pattern of 6 days of work, seventh day of rest, because God did it at the beginning of creation. And it's not just you, but it's your whole household and anyone that falls under your jurisdiction. And we'll get to why that's important in a minute, because that's very important for Israel's mission as the chosen people of God. But what this really highlights is that we're doing this because God made everything in 6 days and then rested on the seventh. And so the idea is that embedded into the framework of creation is this idea that there should be 6 days of work and a seventh day of rest, or a period of work and then a period of rest. And so rabbis speculated a lot about this, and I'll try and find a source for this if I can. It's in one of my books somewhere, but they would even go so far as to say the seventh day, the Sabbath day, is where the universe finds the energy to keep going for another 6 days. Which is, very interesting idea, right? So that's the first verse. The second one I want to read comes from Exodus as well. And this is Exodus chapter 31, 12 through 17. 12 through 17, chapter 31. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, As for you, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, You shall surely observe my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. Therefore you are to observe the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death, for whoever does work on it, that person shall be cut off from his people. For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death. So the sons of Israel shall observe the Sabbath to celebrate the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the sons of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, but on the seventh day he ceased from labor and was refreshed. So this one says a lot of the same stuff, and then obviously puts in a death commandment.
Right.
And that's pretty intense. We're not going to do that. We're not going to bring that one back. But what is really interesting about this, and this is something I think that we can glean, is he says, and this is in verse 13, You shall surely observe my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. So he's saying, this is a day that you're dedicating to me, that you're ceasing all of your toil, all of your work, all of your achievement, and you're going to find a spiritual sort of refreshment in it, which will make you realize that it is me working in you and through you that makes you holy and sanctified. Amen. Like,
right? Yeah.
It's not you being great. It's me in you being great. And so the Sabbath is a way to do that. Abraham Joshua Heschel was a rabbi, and I think he's in like the 60s. And he has a book called The Sabbath that talks a lot about this. And he has an idea that the Sabbath is a way in which man partakes in eternity. So it's not just resting because your body needs to just chill for a minute, but it's actually a form of worship in which we're partaking in the kingdom of heaven and in realizing that time is eternal and that there is a world beyond our 6 days of expanding space, expanding our influence over material things. And so this kind of goes into that idea. Now here's another one from Deuteronomy, and this one I think is huge, and we'll have a lot to say about us today as well. So this is in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or daughter, or your male servant or female servant, or your ox or donkey, or any of your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you, so that your male servant and female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to obey and observe the Sabbath day. So this one, again, it's all encompassing. If someone's staying in your inn, they have to Sabbath. If it's a servant or slave, they have to Sabbath. Male, female, any kind of beast of the field, Sabbath. If it's work that needs to be done on the farm, don't do it, Sabbath. So it's all encompassing. But notice, in all the other ones, he linked it to creation or to God's own holiness. In this one, he particularly links the reason for observing it to being rescued from a society that enslaved them. And so this is a callback to Exodus 1 and 2, where you see the Israelites enslaved to the Egyptians who increase their workload and they make their entire identity based upon their productivity. And they're objectifying these human beings who are made in the image of God and turning them into pure tools of productivity and gain and personal achievement at the expense of their God-given humanity. So the Sabbath is a way in which we resist that tendency of empire. I mean, you think about it. Every major nation has enslaved people, and they've objectified and misused people and taken their dignity from them to use them for their own gain. Sabbath is literally a way for the Israelites to stop that from becoming a norm for them. Because not only do they partake in it, but everyone that is a servant has to also partake in it, which is inherently humanizing. And so that's another really important verse in the Old Testament. So that's all I have for the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm. I have some questions, but I'm going to wait, I think, because they're going to definitely go on tangents, I think. So let's go ahead and
that's fine.
To the point that you're done reading.
I'm done reading for now, because we'll talk about these in and of themselves, and then we'll go to the New Testament to kind of set the paradigm for us as Christians.
So one of the first things I noticed, I guess, would be that it seems like one of the main importances of Sabbath was the community that it brought. It wasn't go sit by yourself in your house. It was we as a collective are going to do this, and anyone in our house is going to do this. And I think that that's kind of something that we overlook. Like the Jews obviously still follow that.
Even
like
today,
they all meet together and I wonder, like we kind of say like, oh, that's church, right? We go to church for an hour, but we're not even that close to those people. Or we should be, but we're not typically. And so how can we still get that community if we're not meeting like the Jews do or did during Sabbath?
Yeah.
How do we get that community?
Yeah. Well, I think it's an excellent point. And even today, so the Sabbath practice of Jews starts Friday at sundown and ends Saturday at sundown. And it always begins with a meal that, and they would have a cup of wine, they would say a blessing, and they would light candles, and then they're done working. They prepare all the food before sundown, and they don't do the dishes after it's done, because that's work, right? And that might be a little hardcore, but it's kind of relieving if you've ever tried it. But they begin it with a family meal, and then the very next day they go to synagogue. And so it's exactly that. It's formed around the idea of resting from any work, even if it's not done, and engaging in the community of the people of God and connecting to the timelessness and eternal values of God's presence. Now, I think for us as Christians, when we moved church to Sunday to be the resurrection day, because, church typically was centered for most of history around the Eucharist, so it was a celebration of the death and resurrection of Christ, so we put it on that day. It still was the same thing. I mean, a lot of early fathers and people would still rest from work on that day. And even still today, it's sort of ingrained that there are places closed on Sunday, like Chick-fil-A, right? The idea was that you're still resting and you're partaking in community with the people of God on that day.
Right. Even though going to Chick-fil-A is kind of like going to church, so.
Well, yeah, everyone knows that. I mean, Chick-fil-A was manna. Chick-fil-A sauce was just manna.
Right.
That's what it is.
Pretty much. So another question I had was when it talks about anyone who's staying with you also observes the Sabbath.
Yeah.
How does that apply to the non-Jew that doesn't observe the Sabbath in that time?
They still have to.
Now, how do you enforce that? Like, if somebody's staying with you, you're not going to tell them you can't leave the house.
Well, but say I'm from Rome and we're in the time of Jesus and I sojourn to Jerusalem and I'm staying at an inn. If everything shuts down, everything, the inn shuts down, the innkeeper's not doing anything, they're not cleaning, they're not making food, they're not serving beer, and no shops are open, and all of the Jews that live in the land are at synagogue and doing what they do on Sabbath, you almost don't have a choice.
Right.
Now as Christians, that's a little different because obviously, and especially today, it's different because, 50 years ago, everything was closed on Sunday, and even if you weren't a Christian, you kind of had to rest on that day just because it was closed. Yeah. But I think thinking about this for myself, if someone was staying with me and it happened to be on whatever day I choose as my Sabbath, I would just let them know, like, hey, this is the day that I rest and enter Sabbath rest, and I'm really intentional about cultivating community on it, but I'm also intentional about not partaking in activities that for me are work or toil in any way. So I shut off my phone, I shut off my computer as far as possible. I try not to go do anything strenuous unless it's life-giving, like maybe go for a bike ride or a hike. And I would love for you to participate in that with me. Maybe we even share a meal and do a blessing like a traditional Jewish person would have done. So it could be invitational, whereas, so I don't think today the infrastructure is there to have, strict observance of that.
And I feel like back then, and even up probably till when my parents were born, if you were staying at somebody's house, you observed what they did.
Yes.
That was like part of going somewhere is that, you observe these things, you go to church, I do what you do because I'm at your house.
Yeah.
But we don't do that anymore. So it's kind of there is a separation there that I think is a cultural separation that we can't really enforce anymore.
Well, and I think, yes, until maybe a lot of us individually start doing this and becoming intentional, and then maybe once again, at least as a church community, we can sort of share this. I know for me, when I take days off, I'm extroverted. And when I have a Sabbath day, I still like to be around people. I still like to do things with them that are life-giving. So I don't really want to go binge Netflix because even if that seems leisurely, it's not inherently restful or life-giving. And it's definitely not worshipful in this setting, right?
Sure.
And that was the other big part of this is it's an act of worship. But I definitely am more intentional about finding community on those days. And if I can do it on Sunday, which I was in this past season where I couldn't, but now I'm coming into one where I can. If I can do it on Sunday, I try to, because then you're with your church community and you're getting that into it. And then you can build the rest of your day around whatever is going to be beneficial for you.
Now I'm going to kind of change topics here a little bit. How I see, so Chick-fil-A is a good example. They do not hurt financially from being shut down for a day. A lot of people think, I got to be doing things all the time to stay ahead of things.
Yeah.
Clearly, that's not the case.
No.
And all the Jews that live in LA and New York, they do it every single week.
Yeah.
And they're very successful. I know I say all of them. That's obviously
like the Orthodox Jews.
Yeah, I'm talking about a good majority of them are very successful. So that's kind of a lie that we buy into, is that I need to be constantly working to be successful. And it's not true.
It's almost the opposite, actually.
I very much agree.
And well, they're finding this even in a secular sense, that if you have a smaller work week that's not 80 hours, you actually are more productive with the time you have.
For sure.
Whereas if you're working 80 hours a week, you're probably not very focused during all of those. And so, again, this is a beautiful example of a gift God has given us that actually benefits the other 6 days of the week. And that was the whole point of it. So, I mean, and there's tons of stuff like that. So there's a study, I found it earlier. I'm going to try and track it down again, but they found that people who observe a Sabbath, they've, observed Orthodox Jewish communities who observe a very strict Sabbath, like no technology. They have rerouted electric grids, I'm fairly certain, so that it's not even pulsing through their house. Like they can't turn on lights. You know what I mean? Like they're very strict about some of this stuff. But they've found that typically, they have better mental health, better community relationships, better marital intimacy, and some even suggested an increase in overall physical health, which makes sense because you're not stressed out, right? Mm-hmm. So, and that's among people who observe a Sabbath and they're resting from work, toil, and most forms of technology even. And again, we don't necessarily have to be that strict, but that's something to think about.
Sure. And I think one of the big benefits from it is it teaches you discipline. When you're forced to be disciplined like that, where it's like, hey, it doesn't matter what you think, you can't do these things like they do. Now they take it, I'm going to say they take it to an extreme, but that discipline that it's implemented, it works for the rest of your week too. Because then you go, okay, I can make it a whole 24 hours without a phone. Then that means that I can probably let it sit for 2 more hours any other day. But if you don't ever restrict yourself from whatever it is that you decide to not, whatever's considered work, if you can give it up for a whole 24 hours, chances are it'll help you for the rest of the week giving that up, which is typically not needed.
Yeah. Now I want to kind of go into the next point because a lot of listeners are probably going, hold on. Jesus said something about being the Lord of the Sabbath and not needing to do that, and they changed it to Sunday, and that sounds like legalism to me. Well, I want to talk about that for a second because yes, it's true that there were a lot of oral traditions the Pharisees basically invented about the Sabbath, and it's called a fence law. So God gives these commandments, and he actually gave some pretty strict ones, like don't do any kind of work. There's actually a passage, I didn't bring it up here, but I'll maybe post it in the description. There's a passage that says you can't even kindle a fire on the Sabbath. And it doesn't really describe it, but the obvious answer is, well, A, chopping firewood is pretty toilsome. Kindling it can be rough. And then what happens if your house burns down? Because you're resting from all work. Now you have to work, you know what I mean? So you're avoiding all of those pitfalls and to enter into rest, and there's less things to worry about. So there's some, even in the Old Testament, that are fairly strict about things that they wouldn't do on the Sabbath. Now, the Pharisees, and we give them so much crap. For sometimes, yes, Jesus did, and that's why we do. But we forget that oftentimes they had a good intention behind a lot of these laws. So the Pharisees would do what's called a fence law. So here's the law that we can't break, otherwise we're being faithless. We're not being faithful to God. We want to be faithful to God. We want to be his people. We want to be the ones he's called, and we want to be holy. So if this is the law, we can't cross these lines. Let's actually just move the lines out here further and not even cross these ones. Then we won't even come close.
Right.
And so they would debate, okay, well, what's considered work? Well, we get some concrete examples. Okay, can't start fires, and that's in the home, and that's not inherently something I'm making money off of. So there's something about doing that still creates toil in God's eyes that he doesn't want me to participate in. Well, I could argue that plucking gray hairs from my beard is the same way because I'm worried about my appearance and I'm doing this and that hurts really bad when I pluck these hairs and it might cause a tear to come out of my eye that I have to wipe off, and that could be considered work. So let's not even do that. Which arguably maybe that's a good practice, like not worrying about your appearance on this day. That's probably good. But that's strict, right? And so then it gets to the point where Jesus is like, well, if your neighbor's ox falls into a pit and is going to die, you're just going to sit there and watch it. And they'd be like, yep, can't work. And he's like, that's stupid. You've missed it, right?
Right.
So this comes back to the heart of the law versus the execution of the boundaries around it. And so that brings us, I'll go there now, actually, because I think it's a good turning point. This verse from Mark 2, I think, is the key verse for understanding the role of the Sabbath in the life of the Christian. And it's not in the way that you might think, because I'm going to read it and you're going to be like, well, yeah, that says we don't have to do it. But I don't think so. So this is coming after a passage where the Pharisees yell at Jesus and his disciples because they're picking grain fields out of the field. So first thing to know about this, it's in Mark chapter 2, 23. So he's passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath. They are making their way along, picking heads of grain. And the Pharisees say to him, look, what they're doing, what is not lawful on the Sabbath. So first off, what they're doing is lawful as a Jew, it's in the Old Testament law. You're supposed to leave the edges of your field for the poor to go and pick grains and eat. You're not allowed to reap the edges of your field. So, and Jesus, they were poor. They're walking around with nothing but the tunic on their back.
Whoa, that's controversial. Jesus was rich. According to the prosperity gospel, Jesus was wealthy.
That is a
But
whole other episode.
Sorry. That wouldn't be a bad idea to do an episode on that.
We could do one on that.
Different topic.
So anyways, what they're doing is lawful, and it's not lawful. It's not just lawful, like permitted. It's something that you're commanded to do as a faithful Jew. You're commanded to dedicate the edges of your field for the poor to go eat from so that they can survive. It's kind of like a implemented means of making sure everyone in your community has access to food. And Jesus and his disciples are taking advantage of that. Well, the Pharisees are trying to trap him, and they're trying to say, well, yeah, that might be lawful, but you're doing it on the Sabbath and you're plucking grains and that's considered work. It's like, well, if I'm doing this to eat and not starve, is that work? Would you really prohibit an act of charity and goodwill towards a brother because you consider it work in this instance?
I mean, he does that all the time on the Sabbath, where he heals somebody and all that, and that's what he's saying.
And that's work.
You're missing the heart of it.
Exactly, same thing. Well, and he actually mentions a story where David and his companions go into the temple, and it wouldn't have been a temple; it would have been a tabernacle. But they go into the tabernacle and enter the place of the high priest and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. And he also gave it to those who were with him. So he brings that up and he's saying, well, David did this and it was permitted and encouraged. So this is way less of what would be an infringement in your mind, because that's an actual breaking of an actual law in the Old Testament, not some convoluted interpretation and fence law about the law that's there. And so he's like, well, if David broke that law and it was permitted because he was hungry, because he needed that bread, if he could eat the bread of the temple that's consecrated and holy, that anyone else, they would die if they ate it, then this is God's heart towards the situation, right? And then he says this is the verse that I wanted to mention. It's Mark 2, 27 and 28. Oh, what, is my camera dying?
I think so.
Hold on. We'll read it in just a second, but I think my camera's dying.
Yeah, well, I'll just go ahead and continue off of that. So how do we, and I know you're going to read this verse again, it might answer my question.
Oh, it totally died.
I'm getting distracted now. Can't think.
Well, that's okay. So the video won't be a video this time. We tried, but
just didn't work out. Battery died. So go ahead and read. Maybe it'll answer my question, actually.
Okay. So we went through all that, right? What Jesus was doing was fine, and another part of Scripture demonstrate that God's heart towards this situation of someone, breaking what would be an outward law for the sake of surviving, it would be good. It would be fine because David ate the temple bread, didn't die, and it was fine. So then he says this: the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And that's the key. And so we need to hear a different message from this than the Pharisees need. Because what they needed to hear was, you weren't made to observe strict laws about this day. They were actually made for the benefit of you. And so what they needed to hear is just, dude, relax a little bit. This is supposed to be something that's life-giving and a gift. And so in instances where something happens that might break the external law, but it would still be life-giving, well, in that instance, it probably should be permitted. For instance, we're starving, we need to eat the field out of this grain, or David needs to enter the tabernacle and eat the bread of presence, or we need to rescue an ox from a pit to stop my neighbor from going bankrupt because his entire net wealth just fell in a pit and died, Yeah. So all of those would be life-giving in a different sense, and even though they might break the externals, they're permitted. And he's like, I say this on the authority that I'm the Son of Man.
Right.
Yeah.
So a couple things I have here. So Jesus did observe the Sabbath. Now, did he observe it? How did he observe it in a way that we can then also observe it without being Jews ourselves?
Yeah. Well,
because that's what I always see is whenever people mention Jesus observed the Sabbath, and then the other side goes, yeah, but he was a Jew, so that's why he was doing it, not because.
Yeah.
But yet Jesus did it. So I feel like if Jesus is doing something, we should probably pay attention. Even if it was part of his culture, he still observed it. So where can we draw the line of, okay, we don't need to observe it like the Jews did?
Yeah.
Where
Well,
does that
this
fall?
comes back to, so a lot of interaction with the Old Testament gets tricky because you're like, well, he fulfilled the Old Testament law. Like, and so Acts 15 is the first council of the church where Paul and Peter say, okay, well, Gentiles who become Christian don't have to be circumcised, even though Jews did.
Right.
And they don't have to follow the dietary laws, even though Jews did. And even Jews who were Christians still did. And in the case of Messianic Jews, a lot of them still do today. And they believe in Jesus as the Messiah. But so what they're saying is it's not the righteousness that comes from external observance of the law. It's the righteousness of the faithfulness of Jesus and our trust in that. It's our faith in Christ, right? And those lead you into the moral laws. Those lead you towards the Spirit, which leads you to observe the moral components of those. And so this is a really tough topic. It's not one that you just say, oh, here's the answer. There's a lot of different opinions on this. I tend to think that the heart behind every Old Testament law still would have an application with an external today, insofar as if you're following the Spirit of God, He'll lead you to the same law written on your heart.
Sure.
And it just might be externally executed in a different way.
Yeah, because if he completely got rid of it, like totally, then why do we have it?
Yeah.
Like, we would have no reason to read the Old Testament if it didn't apply to us at all.
Yeah.
Now, I know it gives background and all that, and there's other stuff, but they wouldn't have listed all those laws if it wasn't important still.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, another thing to think about is that was God's specific list of commandments for a nation in a particular moment of history. But the interesting thing about the narrative of the Old Testament, and I'll kind of go off on a tangent for this, I think it'll give good context, is originally he just gave them the 10 commandments. And then they failed to keep those. Like if you go back to that chapter, he gives them the 10 commandments. And they hear the voice of God, and Moses reads them to him. And then he's like, okay, well, here's what you're going to do. Do these things. And what's he say? Oh, so God is trying to communicate his 10 commandments to them, just 10 precepts that you can live. And these are still binding on us, I would say. Not in like a legalistic do them or go to hell sense, but like these are things that we should be abiding by. Like, yeah. No duh, don't murder people, don't commit adultery, don't steal. And so it says this, after he gives the 10 commandments, all the people perceived the thunder and lightning and flashes and sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when they saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. And they said to Moses, speak to us yourself and we will listen, but don't let God speak to us or we will die. So here's God saying, I want to reveal myself to you and show you my ways. I rescued you from Egypt without you doing anything because I love you and made covenant with your forefathers and remembered you in your suffering. And I want to make you a king, a nation of kings and priests, holy to me, a light to all of the Gentiles. And I want to reveal myself to you. And they say, nope, he's too scary for me. Moses, we're going to die if he talks to us. So they show an unwillingness because they're probably afraid of like, well, if we screw up and he kills us, I don't want to have to deal with that. And so Moses says, do not be afraid. For God has come in order to test you, in order that the fear of him may remain with you so that you may not sin. And so the people looked at a distance while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. And so then God kind of recaps some of the commandments and then talks about the temple and institutes temple worship and then gives ordinances. So all of the ordinances in 21 and following in Exodus are really built off the 10 commandments and giving particular examples. And it's, again, so God gives this law, the law this big, right? And then like, that's scary.
Small, by the way.
Yeah, it's really small. Oh, that's right. The video turned off. So we're not. Yeah. So he gives a really small list of commandments, and the people are terrified of them. They're like, we don't want to hear from God directly. That's going to kill us. And those are kind of vague, And so then God's like, okay, well, let me make it easier for you. Here's more that still are built off the same principles, but in specific situations for you.
Yeah. And Jesus kind of covers that later when he says the greatest commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart. And the second is love your neighbors yourself. All the others are just these cover all the rest.
Exactly.
And it really does. And he even simplifies it way more. Because they were like, 10 is like too much. So he gives them more so they don't like freak out. And then Jesus goes completely opposite way and says, really, there's only 2. But if you observe these correctly, all the others fall in place.
Exactly. And I would agree with that. Well, we have to agree with it because Jesus said it.
Right. But it totally is true.
It makes sense.
You wouldn't murder somebody because you love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
Period. Like, it's funny how it just kind of like covers all the rest. So I did have one more question here. Now, I think it's easy for people to say, and I say people, meaning I've said this before, that we don't work physically like they did back then. We are not physically exhausted like them. Now, you might be able to find a few professions here and there, but even then, I don't think... I mean, my dad was a logger, and I still don't think he did as much physical labor as they were probably doing back in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's probably true.
They did a lot of work.
They were, yeah.
So it's easy to see that, yes, they needed the day off for physical rest.
Yes.
How does that apply to us now that our jobs, like mine, I sit on a computer all day.
Yeah.
I record videos for a living. So how do I rest from that, even though I love doing that? Mm-hmm. And I don't find it work enough. For me to record a YouTube video is fun.
Yeah.
So how does that apply to somebody like me?
So I would say this. I would say that there's a mental aspect to work, and especially work like that. It's mentally and emotionally exhausting,
Definitely.
even if you love it. So like, I love making videos too, but you know the feeling of exhaustion after a 10-hour shoot.
Yeah.
How tired are you?
Oh, way more tired than I was ever working in the oil field.
Yeah. And editing, if you have to spend all day editing a wedding.
Sure.
That's like, you just need to get away from the computer, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that's a sign that something about that form of work still has a form of toil or what we would consider, I guess, work in that sense built into it that you should refrain from on one day.
Sure. So here's another question going on that.
Yeah.
If I was to, so I don't work out, and I should, but I don't. Yeah. If I was to, on my Sabbath day, we'll just say Sunday, that was my day for getting physical activity and exercise, do you think that would work for me as being my rest? Because that is my way of reinvigorating myself for the rest of the week.
Yeah. So here's where I would say yes. If you were an Orthodox Jew, you'd probably smack me for saying that, because you'd be like, no, you got to physically rest. And I'd be like, well,
but
yes.
I physically rest all day.
I was going to say, most of our jobs are, like you said, they're not physically exhausting. And to be honest, most of the health problems and stress problems we have come from that. So if Sabbath is a day, just like Jesus said in this paradigm here, that is a gift for us to participate in the eternity of God's kingdom in this present world and be filled by him and his presence and rest from all of our earthly concerns, even if they're not done for the week. And if it's supposed to give us life and refresh us, well, then, yeah, if working out, or for me, riding a bike or hiking, if that refreshes you, then yeah.
It would probably be more along those lines than me just going to the gym and pumping weights.
Yeah.
But still, it's the same kind of thing but there's a lot of people that shouldn't do that on their day off.
Exactly.
They are physically exhausted throughout the week. Then they go on a run and they go on a hike and they go on all this stuff on their day off. And they come back to work on Monday. Yeah, they might be mentally better, but they're still physically exhausted.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, it would be the opposite, where I would get done working out and be like, oh man,
you have more energy.
I needed that to get through the week. So it's just because people have so many different professions now that I think it's hard to say that there's any kind of line of, you can do this or you can't do that.
Well, I would say there's certain things. Obviously, if it's work that you're getting paid for, the heart of the law would be, well, the whole point is that you don't do that.
Sure.
And so then anything that's the same sort of paradigm of like, I'm doing this as a way. So Heschel does this really well. He explains that 6 days a week, we are working in what he calls the realm of space. And man's progress in civilization, what he calls technical civilization, is the increase of his influence over the realm of space. So anything you're doing to, so it said, increase your influence over the realm of space is something that the paradigm would be, try to rest from that and put it down, because the whole heart of it is that you're participating not in your own expansion of yourself or your influence over material things or gain in a worldly sense, but that you're participating in an eternal sort of value and humanizing refreshment that's only given by God. And so that's a lot of big words, but it's, I think that's the heart of it. So, and this is where it comes to an individual sort of being fully convinced in your own mind, like Paul talks about.
I think that mind in your own mind is a big thing, because I think if we just observe Sabbath without thinking about it, we're missing the point again.
Yeah.
You need to consciously know that today is my day of rest, and everything you do that day needs to be a conscious decision, which is why I think vegging out on Netflix is a bad idea.
Probably a bad idea.
I'm not saying I'll go watch a movie, because that is, for me, is like one of the best things for me to relax. And I mean, being a film guy, I mean, I will still be analyzing it and loving it, but it's different. It's not, I'm not going to go write a critique of a movie. I'm going to just sit down, throw in a movie I love and just watch it. But that's one movie, And I think it's a lot different than vegging out.
Because you're intentional about it. That's something that engages your heart and mind. Right. It's refreshing to you.
And I'm not going to put in a movie that I know I'm not going to be paying attention to.
Yeah.
I'm going to deliberately pick a movie that will benefit me.
Yeah.
I don't want to say spiritually because that's weird because it's a movie, but it kind of does.
It's invigorating.
That's how artists think. Like for somebody to be painting that like invigorates them. Like, so for me to watch a movie, it's very, very different than me making a movie. Yeah. And so for me, that's like the rest from the making of the video is for me to like enjoy the product of the video.
Yeah. Well, and so here's another kind of idea maybe to kind of frame our approach to our own rest, and then we'll go into Hebrews because there's probably still some people going, well,
get to that pretty quick.
Yeah, there's probably some people going, okay, well, maybe there's a good idea and I can benefit from it, but do I need to? So first off, that's the wrong attitude, because here's what you're saying essentially, I think, and I've said this before, and this is why I'm really trying to implement Sabbath, because I've been like, well, it's not a requirement, right? And it's like, well, okay, maybe not, but here's what that sounds like to me in my heart when I feel that way. Jesus gave me this beautiful gift, something that's going to be for my sake and for my life and for the sake of everyone else around me. It's going to humanize me and stop me from objectifying other people. It's going to connect me with the rhythms of creation and connect me with Him in a unique way. And all of these we've just demonstrated biblically. Who would I be to say, nah, I don't need that gift, Jesus?
Because it's not required.
Because it's not required. Yeah. That's, it's the same thing as like when someone's like, well, like, so when someone's talking about like, okay, well, I can't have sex with my girlfriend, but what can we do? It's like, well, you're already approaching this with the wrong heart because you're trying to see how close you can get to breaking the law, or how close you can get to not participating in the fullness of the life God has for you. Mm-hmm. And so I think for me, I want to approach it with the opposite of like, if God has something He wants to give me, I want to be the type of person who takes it with open arms.
Sure.
Even if it changes everything about my life. Mm-hmm. And that's not legalistic, like, oh, I got to do all these things, otherwise God's going to smite me. That's like God knows what's best for me. And if He has an idea of what I should be doing with my time and a way that I can be more human, then of course I want to implement that. And of course I want to take it to its fullest, because that is going to give me, like Jesus said, life, and life to the fullest.
Yeah, I mean, let's go ahead and read Hebrews. See what it has to say.
So this first off is difficult because there's a lot of different ways that he's using rest and talking about the idea of rest, but he references the Sabbath a lot, and then he says something really important. I think it's in verse 9. So starting in 1.
And I do want to say, for anyone who maybe this is your first podcast that you've listened to, this is way more... we're more in the Bible here in terms of reading it than we normally are, because this topic has to be. Yeah. It can't just be my opinion on things. This is something we have to, whereas other topics, it's more of we're more opinionated on things. We're like, okay, this is what I believe. Here's why I believe it. Whereas Sabbath is a very... I don't know. You have to be in the Bible.
Well, we're not really familiar with it. So that's why, exactly. So this is in Hebrews 4, coming just after where he's talking about Jesus being our high priest in chapter 3. And then, sorry, I'm peeling this page. And then talking about the peril of unbelief and not obeying God at the end of chapter 3. So let's see here. And he actually brings up what we talked about in chapter 3, the Israelites who heard the law and were like, nope, don't want to do that. So, it says he swore that they would not enter his rest because they were disobedient. So they were not able to enter because of unbelief. That's the end of chapter 3. And then chapter 4 begins with this. Therefore, let us fear if, while a promise remains of entering his rest, that any one of you may seem to have come short of it. For indeed, we have had good news preached to us, just as they also did. But the word they heard did not profit them, because it was not united by faith in those who heard. For we who have believed enter that rest, just as he said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter their rest, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage, they shall not enter my rest. Therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience. He again fixes a certain day, today, saying through David after so long, just a time as has been said before, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest so that no one will fall through following the same example of disobedience. For the word of God is a living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, and piercing as far as the division of soul and spirit, of both joints and marrow, and able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart. And there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are open and laid bare to the eyes of him with whom we have to do. So here, first off, in verse 9, he says, so there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And he links it as a way of participating in a life, and in the life of Jesus. Today, if you hear his voice, not harden your hearts, but participating in the life of the kingdom so that we will not fall into disobedience. Because the people he references in the Old Testament, in that same passage we read in Exodus, hardened their hearts and did not hearken to his voice. And all throughout Israel, actually in all of their history, when you read the prophets, one of the first charges against them in all of the prophetic witness is that they have not been observing the Sabbath. And so this kind of comes back again to the Sabbath is not some legalistic thing that we just obey because God gets mad at us if we don't, but it's literally a means through which God gives us the grace to be more obedient. And on a practical sense, you mentioned this earlier, if I'm doing these things disciplined and being disciplined about it on the Sabbath, that's sort of empowering me to be more disciplined about them and more aware of them throughout the week.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the whole point.
And God never tells us to do something that, in hindsight, didn't benefit us. We think in the moment, we're like, why do we have to observe Sabbath? Why don't we want to?
Exactly.
We should be excited to. We get to rest and not work. And that should be the highlight of our week, should be Sabbath day. But we just don't approach it with that. We just seem to think of all these things that God tells us to do as negatives. But man, how much more freeing is it if you live in everything he tells you to do?
Yeah.
And in not a legalistic way.
Yeah.
But in what he truly wants, which is with the heart.
The structure and discipline is the freedom.
Yeah. Can you imagine just how successful, like, in the world you would be if you observed all the disciplines that Jesus tells you to?
Yeah.
Like,
you would
be so successful.
Remarkably different from anyone else they'd met before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think our goal should be how successful can I be, so I'm going to do these things. But that's a benefit from following what he tells you to do.
Yeah.
He's not going to hinder your life because you're following what he says.
Yeah.
Now, it might come across that way to some people or to the world, but when you are truly happy in Jesus, nothing else matters. And because that's the ultimate goal. And so there's so many things that you're just like, you'll be missing out on this or that or whatever. And it's like, yeah, but look at the other huge benefits from doing these things.
Yeah. And well, so that kind of wraps up that part of our conversation. We've gone through a lot of scriptures that support the idea that Sabbath was made for man. It was a gift that God is trying to give to you. It's something that he wants to meet you in. It's a rhythm he wants to invite you in that shapes and forms the rest of your life towards a life more integrated and holistic and dedicated to him. He wants to bless you with it. He wants to give you something so sweet and beneficial that it will remarkably shift the rest of your life. I want to talk a bit before we end about why we're even talking about Sabbath in today's culture. Because we talked a lot about what it was for the Jews, what it might be for us, why it's something that we should think about as more than just something the Jews did or something we could do on Sundays, but as something that should be an integral practice for our own lives. So today, we are anti-Sabbath culture. And I don't mean Christians. I mean the world is anti-Sabbath. We are anti-rest and we are productivity obsessed. So if you think about a lot of the people that you follow, a lot of the people that seem the most successful, they are grinding 24/7, 8 days a week, 368 days a year. Like they're just going more than is humanly possible. They have the bags under their eyes. And even if you're not capable of that, think about what your default answer usually is, and I'm speaking very generally here, when someone asks you how you're doing. Oh, I'm good, but I'm so busy. Like I say that a lot. Like, oh, it's good, it's busy. Oh, busy's good. Yeah, busy's good. Busy's really good. And that's kind of like the default culture, isn't it? Busyness is the virtue of modernity because productivity is the only measurement of success. And that's kind of a bit drastic, but there is a very real sense in which our productivity, our expanding influence over what Heschel would call space, is our measurement of how much we're worth. And well, the there is a lot of studies that are suggesting that the opposite's actually true, because this is increasing depression and anxiety. It's increasing burnout. Like, people will seriously have psychological breakdowns because they're going too hard, too fast for too long. And there's increased health issues that come with that.
Yeah. And I think a big part of that isn't necessarily just if I'm doing one job wholeheartedly, but we have all these other little things that we bring in that just exhaust us.
Yeah.
And I keep going back to the Facebook thing or the social media thing.
Yeah. What's a big one for our generation?
Just imagine, so you go to work for, we'll say a 10-hour day, right? These are the people that work a lot. Then they get home and they go on Facebook for an hour.
Yeah.
And then Twitter and all this stuff. Like, that extra stress level that you're adding is almost as bad as the 10 hours you just worked.
Yeah.
Because now you're not giving yourself any time to relax. So then you go to bed and you get up in the morning, you're on Facebook again in the morning, then you go to work, you work 10 more hours, you get home back on, like, there is zero rest for people.
Or Netflix could be part of that too, because it's not restful, it's stimulating.
And you used to see, like, the joke is that back in the day, the dad would get home from work and sit on the couch and read the newspaper. That's the same thing. Mm-hmm. He's not actually resting. They came. It was, I'm doing air quotes here. It was resting because they weren't physically doing labor.
Yeah, they weren't doing the thing that actually got them paid.
Right. Yeah. And it's like that. All those things that we're adding in are just as bad as those hard work days.
Yeah. Well, and I think it comes back to the idea of there's a time to work and there's a time to rest from work. So that's out of Ecclesiastes. There's a time for war, a time for peace, a time for sorrow, a time for joy. And what is man's lot but to work and enjoy the fruits of his labor? And we read that and we're like, oh, that's super nihilistic and sad. It's like, well, actually, no. It's kind of the rhythm of life, I think, is what Solomon's talking about there, right? Like, what is our lot to go work hard, and then when we're done working, to enjoy the fruit of what we did.
Yeah.
But how much are we actually still toiling in our minds when we're on social media or when we're watching Netflix? We're toiling in our hearts when we're going after those things instead of resting in what's been done, what we have done, and what we've completed. I think the reason I wanted to do an episode on Sabbath, and the reason I wanted to really bring so much scripture and build a case for it as a practice, not something that you have to do, but something that is a gift that will bless you, is because I think this, if we started doing it, if I started doing it, and if you started doing it, and if all you listening implemented this into your life as a regular practice, imagine how refreshing you would be to be around. Because you would not be resting from work. You would actually be working from your rest. And that's the difference. You're not, oh my gosh, I'm so tired, I just have to lay down. I have to go to bed. I'm so excited to go to sleep. But you would actually have this deep well of just pure joy from God. You would have this deep well of experience and rest and dignity in your soul from which you could go forward the next 6 days and work.
Yeah. I'm going to start when I meet people on Sundays and we're like, hey, what are you resting from today? I'm going to start approaching that and seeing what people respond, because they're going to be like,
I'm not. I'm going to go do this right now, and I'm going to go put in 6 hours of work. Yeah.
But I think, we talked on one of the last podcasts that, like, I deleted Facebook from my phone. And that's also going to be my main thing. And it's like, people do it for Lent. They give up something. Like, why aren't we giving up these things every week?
I try to give up coffee.
Yeah.
Coffee got the best of me.
So I'm going to give up Facebook all of Sunday. I'm not going to touch it. Doesn't matter. And that'll just be the one way that I'm going to start resting. Yeah. And I don't think you can go cold turkey on this.
No, you got to kind of work slow. And all of these are that way. I mean, we're talking about a lot of spiritual disciplines.
Yeah.
So here's a challenge too. Because it's hard to implement this. Full discretion and honesty, I still, to this day, don't have the full Sabbath day that I want once a week.
Sure.
I tried to do it on Thursdays for a while, and then I was starting a new business and all this stuff. I let it get the best of me because I hadn't gotten to a point where it was disciplined and I could structure my life around it yet. But I make small steps. So sometimes I'll rest for half a Thursday and then half a Friday, or half a Wednesday night and half a Thursday. I'll get it in where I can. But here's a great place to start. Most of us probably work jobs that require that we have a 15-minute break, a 30-minute lunch, and a 15-minute break. I would challenge you to begin cultivating the idea of little mini Sabbaths on those breaks. Because most of us, like, if you go into your break room, at least at my job, everyone's on their phone and they're doing something. They're participating in that toil.
Sure.
What if you literally just walked outside and just sat for 15 minutes in solitude, and you were with God and cultivated that awareness there? And then on lunch, instead of taking out your phone, maybe read a book, because that's at least a little more restful, arguably. If you're reading like a fiction book, it's like it actually is restorative, whereas Facebook probably isn't. But with those small times that you have, what if you intentionally use those to start implementing this type of rest? And then work up to however it fits into your life and schedule best, maybe having a full day or at least a very large amount of time where you're resting from anything that isn't giving you life and helping you cultivate a greater awareness of God.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah.
I'm going to start trying to implement some of this stuff.
Yeah.
We'll see how
well
it
and for
goes.
you and I, like working from home, I mean, you almost have to use a timer and just say, okay, it's not done, but I'll go take a break for a little bit, you know. Or like, hey, I know that this project has time sensitivity, but I will not be working on it on Sunday at all. You know, stuff like that. And that's really about it. Just again, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for you. It's a gift that God wants to give you.
Yeah, why wouldn't you want to observe it?
Why wouldn't we want to observe it?
And we always come up with excuses, but man, this should be something we look forward to. And I think we do have to make it kind of a personal Sabbath. I don't think that we're all the same anymore because we have so many different kind of jobs and what each of us rest totally differently. Yeah. Come up with what for you is exciting. Yeah. What is true rest for you, and do that. And I think it'll benefit your life a lot.
Yes. Yes. So just to end, if you guys want some more resources on this, some more reading, obviously read the Bible. We're gonna put all the verses that we read and maybe a couple others in the description of this podcast so you can kind of check my work. If you think I'm full of crap, email me. Let's talk about it. But I want you to get it from the Bible and engage with it yourself. But then more than that, here's what shaped my understanding. So there's a book called The Sabbath by Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a Jewish rabbi. So he's not a Christian, but reading that will give you an insight to how they saw the Sabbath in a healthy way. So he doesn't have a legalistic view. He has a very spiritual, sort of kingdom-minded view of what it is for him. And it's just a rich book full of so much that can help you start to integrate this into your life. So The Sabbath by Abraham Joshua Heschel. John Mark Comer, who's the pastor of Bridgetown Church in Portland, he has a book called Garden City, which is about work and rest for the glory of God. So that's a good one if you're working. How does my work glorify God? How if I'm an accountant or a carpenter or whatever and not a pastor, how does it give God glory? He talks more about that, but he also talks about the Sabbath. He also, if you look up their podcast, Bridgetown Church Audio Podcast, you can just search Sabbath in there and you'll find a couple episodes on that. Rob Bell talks about this a little bit, but there are probably better places to go. I think the Bama podcast might mention it.
I'm sure they do.
Yeah, they surely mention it. But I would start there. I would start with the book The Sabbath by Heschel and then Garden City by John Mark Comer. Just a shameless plug for those two resources. And then, of course, Scripture. That's all we have for you guys today. Hopefully you found this conversation edifying. If you did, as always, shoot us an email at thedanielgen@gmail.com. That'll be in the description as well. And engage with us with questions about this or any other types of content that might be relevant to this discussion. And anything that can help you be more faithful to Jesus and also creatively missional towards culture. From all of us here at the Daniel Generation, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Adios.